Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
This episode is part of a long series exploring how some evangelicals tied themselves to the Republican Party in the 1970s and 80s. This one can stand on its own, but will make a lot more sense as part of the whole. The first episode of this season is titled Prologue, What is Biblical? If you want to look for it after this one. For the next few weeks, I'll be presenting a series of mini-episodes that look at various aspects of the Reagan presidency. We'll all need to keep an open mind, because I'm covering some of the hard realities of those years. Reagan has become such an icon of the conservative movement that it's important that we stop and take stock of his time in office. Some of that is going to be positive, and some of what we're talking about today is going to be positive. And some of it will require critique. This is Ronald Reagan's Star Wars. The end of the Carter years were marked by a hostage crisis. Some say that Carter lost because the hostages weren't freed until the day of Reagan's inauguration. But here's the reality. That way of thinking just isn't historically accurate. A survey revealed that Americans who saw the hostage crisis as the most important issue, well, they mostly preferred Carter to Reagan. Like Goldwater in 1964, some voters worried that Reagan was trigger-happy with nuclear weapons. In fact, there was a nasty joke going around.
What's green and glows? Iran, 15 minutes after Ronald Reagan's inauguration.
In October of 1965, during the war in Vietnam, Reagan said the U.S. should
pave the whole country and put parking stripes on it.
About as extreme a statement as you can make, enough to get people nervous about Reagan. This was only 1 year after Goldwater made his run for the presidency. People were on edge about nuclear weapons. During the Cold War, there was concern about falling behind the Soviets. In the space race, schools, higher education, even home kitchen design. Look it up. Then there was a report by a defense intellectual named Paul Nitze in 1957 that was leaked to the public. It argued that the US had fallen behind the Soviets in weaponry. There was just one problem. The report was based on inaccurate Air Force intelligence. It said that the Soviets had 1,000 intercontinental ballistic missiles. You know how many they really had? 4. Not 400, 4. But it didn't matter. The legend was just too good. John F. Kennedy, running for re-election in the Senate, accused the Eisenhower administration of allowing a missile gap.
We are losing the satellite missile race with the Soviet Union because of complacent miscalculations, penny-pinching budget cutbacks, incredibly confused mismanagement, and wasteful rivalries and jealousies.
As a reminder, we weren't losing. Actually, we were ahead. The narrative was just too powerful a political tool. It was reinforced by an intelligence panel nicknamed Team B that arrived at the same result. Their evidence was just as shaky. They concluded that not only would the Soviets destroy our nuclear arsenal in one decisive strike, but they wanted to do just that. As you can imagine, these reports generated a lot of fear as Americans came to terms with a doomsday scenario. The military strategy of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, had been in place for decades. It was essentially this. If one country has a nuclear bomb,
we're so powerful, everybody will have to take orders from us out of fear of getting nuked.
They can essentially hold others hostage with fear. But if another country builds a nuclear bomb,
they can't use their nuclear weapons because if they do, they will be met with a nuclear response.
Mutually assured destruction hypothetically leads to a standoff. We can't use our nuclear weapons because if we do, we know they'll use theirs on us. For decades, that strategy kept nuclear war at bay. But things seemed to be ratcheting up. Team B incorrectly concluded that the Soviets intended to ride out a nuclear holocaust, building enough bunkers to wait out the radiation. Once the shelters were complete, they would feel empowered to use their nuclear arsenal, provoke a war. The timing of their report made sense. It was leaked before Jimmy Carter took office. Neoconservatives wanted to keep advancing the Cold War, to make a strong show against communism. They did that by stoking fears. Carter just didn't fit that strategy. The president-elect was talking about doing away with nuclear weapons? To those who wanted to escalate the Cold War, that just wouldn't do. 4 years later, they called upon the guy who might make Tehran glow at night to keep pushing nuclear weapons, until Ronald Reagan decided to change his mind. You're listening to the show that uses journalistic tools to look inside the Christian church. We press pause on the culture wars in order to explore how we got here and how we can do better. I'm Chris Staron, and this is Truce. Before we really get going, for the fact checkers out there, it's difficult for me to assess who was ahead at which point in the Cold War, mostly because there were so many factors at play. While we had more nuclear weapons early in the Eisenhower administration, as I said a few minutes ago, that wouldn't last long. We could devolve into questions of accuracy, size, capability. That's not the purpose of this episode. After a certain point, who has more is less of an issue because we could blow up the whole world many times over, right? Okay, here's the story. What follows is an actor recreating a Reagan speech from March of 1983. He began by talking numbers. How much could the U.S. spend on defense? Should we make cuts as some Democrats had advocated? If so, which parts of our national defense could we really do without? Then he transitioned to an old standby.
For 20 years, the Soviet Union has been accumulating enormous military might. They didn't stop when their forces exceeded all requirements of a legitimate defensive capability, and they haven't stopped now. During the past decade and a half, the Soviets have built up a massive arsenal of new strategic nuclear weapons that can strike directly at the United States.
Reagan outlined a number of weapons the USSR was building and how we planned to respond, that they were backed by regimes in Angola, Ethiopia, Cuba, not to mention the invasion of Afghanistan. At the end of the speech, the president alluded to something new, the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI.
I am directing a comprehensive and intensive effort to define a long-term research and development program to begin to achieve our ultimate goal of eliminating the threat posed by strategic nuclear missiles.
The speech promoted a defense system located in space that could shoot down missiles before they got anywhere near our borders. The news media dubbed it Star Wars. If we could shoot down nuclear missiles during launch, we could render them, in Reagan's words, impotent and obsolete. It was both a defense strategy and a call to disarm our nuclear arsenal. This speech came just 2 weeks after another he'd made to the National Association of Evangelicals. Remember them? The group established by Harold Ockenga and Billy Graham to bring religious causes before the government and unify evangelicals. This was Reagan's Evil Empire speech. In it, he spent a lot of time talking about abortion, schools, the greatness of the U.S., and then...
In your discussions of the nuclear freeze proposals, I urge you to beware the temptation of pride, the temptation of blithely declaring yourselves above it all, and label both sides equally at fault. To ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding, and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong, and good and evil.
He referred to the Soviets as an evil empire, while cautioning American evangelicals not to question the expensive military buildup. And this from a guy who promised to shrink government spending. And it struck a chord. American evangelicals had been pushing anti-Russian ideology for decades. Preachers like Billy Graham and Jerry Falwell used fears of nuclear war to create a sense of urgency in their messages. They'd been conditioned for this. If you remember way back in season 3, I spent way too much time trying to prove that some of those fears were justified. The communist Soviet Union killed, disappeared, or imprisoned people who disagreed with them. They murdered more of their own people than any other group, except Communist China. So there was reason to be concerned about these guys. SDI would, in theory, keep Americans safe from nuclear attacks by the Soviets. It would hypothetically shoot down any launched missiles. Pew, 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 pew. Nuclear weapons would no longer be able to reach us, and thus, nuclear weapons would be a thing of the past, handing diplomats a real chance of disassembling nukes, something that Carter and Reagan both wanted. There were a number of proposals. One imagined using X-ray lasers to zap missiles from space. Another would use chemical lasers. Pew, 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 pew. Effectively, lasers in space. The US government funded research for space-based lasers well before Reagan's speech, with $68 million approved in 1979 alone, as you may have noticed during the Carter administration. But that was just preliminary research. Missile defense systems had been tried before in the 50s and 70s, generally using projectiles to shoot down missiles. But they'd laid dormant for years. Now space lasers were being pushed by groups like High Frontier, which would soon be absorbed by the Heritage Foundation, the future sponsors of Project 2025 and members of the Council for National Policy. Before Reagan's announcement, it was demonstrated that neither laser technology was going to do the trick. Really takes the helium out of your Zeppelin, doesn't it? So I'm guessing they folded the project and put the money to affordable housing and healthcare? No, of course not. There was money to be spent, a defense buildup to undertake. The 1980 defense budget was $142 billion. 2 years later, it was $222 billion, an increase of $88 billion, with plans for $1.5 trillion more in the next 5 years, establishing budgets adjusted for inflation that rivaled those at the peak of the Vietnam War. Except, this was during peacetime. Which brings us to David Stockman. Stockman was Reagan's first director of the Office of Management and Budget. His goal was a
minimalist government, a spare and stingy creature, which offered even-handed justice, but no more.
He was associated with Arthur Laffer, the father of supply-side economics, what we also call trickle-down economics, or, as George H.W. Bush said, voodoo economics. Stockman and his crew believed in this panacea, that if they lowered taxes on the rich, it would create jobs. And somehow, actually boost tax revenues with all the jobs they'd create. There were other impulses going on at the same time. Congress favored tax cuts, but Reagan wanted a balanced budget. If you want a balanced budget and tax cuts, what do you have to do? Cut spending. So Stockman went to work cutting hundreds of billions of dollars from the federal budget, at the same time as spending on defense skyrocketed. Pew, 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 pew. I tell you about Stockman for a reason, because he made 2 key mistakes.
Mistake number 1.
The tax cuts the administration pushed through were calculated on the assumption of an improving economy. But we were actually headed into a recession. Not only were Americans going to pay a lower percent of their income, but they were also going to be earning less, meaning a big deficit just a year or two before the promised balanced budget of 1984.
Mistake number 2.
The defense buildup was calculated using old information. Now, stay with me. I know there's nothing more exciting in the world than numbers on an audio format. Stockman anticipated that the baseline for the defense budget was going to be $142 billion. So they just tagged on yearly increases based on a percentage.
Last year, you spent $142 billion on defense. Raise that by 7%, and now you've got your budget. Will that be cash or check?
The problem is, thanks to a bunch of factors. The baseline wasn't $142 billion, but $222 billion. So when they went to do an annual increase, instead of multiplying 142 by 1.07, instead, they multiplied 222 by 1.07, meaning the defense budget was much, much larger than they anticipated.
The defense budget increased by 160% in just 6 years.
Stockman made 2 huge calculation errors. Huge! And the government was heading for a deficit. Oops. Leaving them with a handful of options.
They could cut defense spending,
but there were a lot of powerful forces arguing against this one. Reagan said,
"There must be no perception by anyone in the world that we're backing down on the defense buildup."
Because they worried that the U.S. would look weak.
they could move the plan to balance the budget from 1984 to 1986.
But Reagan didn't like that either, saying,
"No, we can't give up the balanced budget. Deficit spending is how we got into this mess."
leaving another unpopular option.
We could raise taxes or put off the tax cuts.
But to supply-side guys like Stockman, this was unthinkable. Unthinkable. The panacea, the magic bullet, was cutting taxes. To raise them, that was... And they certainly couldn't make cuts to Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, even though his staff had made it abundantly clear that the technology just wasn't there. So what did the administration of low taxes and a balanced budget do? They ballooned the national debt. 2 years later, SDI, or Lasers in Space, was on its way to becoming the largest military research program ever undertaken. In real dollars, perhaps twice that of the Manhattan Project. There were some major issues with the program, things that, if you look even a little closer, become painfully obvious.
Objection number 1.
For starters, the targets.
Let's say that the Soviets launched a missile at the US. The missile launches, and the clock's ticking. The space laser system has just a few minutes to blow this thing out of the sky. It's only one target though, right? What's the big deal? Well, one missile can contain many nuclear warheads, so you gotta target not just one moving object, but several. Not only that, missiles can contain dummy objects or clouds of chaff to confuse the computer systems. There are potentially hundreds of targets to shoot down per ICBM. And if more than one missile was fired, you'd have a real mess on your hands trying to avoid the decoys and hit the real target. In an era before advanced computing. Then there was a second issue.
Objection number 2.
No defense shield is perfect.
Even if the US built a missile defense shield that was 99.9% perfect, which it was never going to be, an all-out Soviet attack of 10,000 missiles would still allow 10 nukes through. Even a simple rifle wasn't 99.9% effective.
Objection number 3.
It would not stop every kind of weapon.
As critics of the time noted, it wasn't going to destroy all kinds of weapons. Not bombers, cruise missiles, or short-range missiles launched from submarines. SDI was never going to be a perfect tool to defend the population.
Objection number 4.
It's not that hard to shoot down a satellite.
That's kind of a big deal. If we put dozens or hundreds of space lasers in the sky, our enemies could just shoot them down. Then turn their attention to bombing the US, destroying potentially trillions of dollars of shield with relative ease.
Objection number 5.
Even if we built the defense shield, it might be too heavy to launch into space.
We're not talking about one space laser. We're talking about thousands of pounds and potentially hundreds of units. Could we get something like that into orbit? Not only was the technology not in place for SDI or Star Wars, but even if it were, it wasn't going to keep Americans all that safe. So, why build it? At least in the 1980s, at a time where the smartwatch you have on your wrist right now would be smarter than most computers in the world. But there were reasons to keep it around. Aside from just the greed of defense contractors, like real reasons to keep it around. As the US joined talks with the Soviet Union, SDI would play a key role in diplomacy, giving the United States a strategic edge. While you listen to the ads, leave a positive review for the show on your favorite podcasting app. It really helps people find the show. Okay, here come the ads.
This paid message is from the 2026 Moms, Dads, and Grads gift guide from Christianity Today's Creative Studio. Whether you are celebrating your mother, father, a new graduate, or you want to give a gift just because, these books can become companions for you and those you love, trusting that in their pages lie seeds of transformation. Visit momsdadsgrads.com to browse our books.
This paid message is from Tyndale House Publishers. What if your Jesus is shaped more by culture than by Scripture? We've created a personalized Savior who exists to meet our individual needs and bless our lives. We've made him into a life coach, a therapist for our anxieties, a political ally. That Jesus is safe, manageable, convenient. He fits comfortably into our lives without disrupting them too much. The Missing Messiah, a new book by Kyle Idleman and Mark Moore, helps us understand how Western culture has gradually reshaped Jesus into our image and recognize the difference between a personalized Savior and a revolutionary king. It's about the true cost as well as the true gain when we stop treating Jesus like a spiritual accessory and start following him as the Messiah. If you believe there's a more dangerous, more majestic Messiah than the one you've inherited, visit missingmessiah.com to learn more.
Welcome back. Today we're talking about SDI, Star Wars, or the Strategic Defense Initiative. In February of 1987, President Reagan met with officials in charge of defense. In that meeting, Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger called for 36 kinetic kill vehicles to be launched into space, saying they could destroy 2,000 warheads. Journalist and historian Francis Fitzgerald wrote this about the meeting.
But this was nonsense. In the first place, 60 orbiting hit-to-kill vehicles could hardly destroy 2,000 warheads. And in the second, there was nothing to deploy, and everyone in the room, with the possible exception of the president, knew that.
Nearing the end of the second term, after years of research and billions of dollars spent, it was obvious to most people in the administration that SDI could not work. Yet here was the Secretary of Defense pushing for more money for the program. So why keep it? One reason is that SDI was a major bargaining chip. The Soviets did not like it. As you can imagine, they weren't excited about having US-based weapons flying over their heads. When the US opened up talks with Soviet leaders, SDI gave them leverage. Also, Reagan came into office with people concerned about his finger being on the trigger. In fact, by 1982, 57% of Americans believed that he would get us into a nuclear war. SDI was a way to calm their fears. Do you see it? The administration was trying to prove that not only was he not trigger happy, he was trying to actively defend the country. In a funny twist of history, Reagan decided he'd pick up the mantle carried by Jimmy Carter. He wanted to do away with nuclear weapons. Again, in Reagan's mind, SDI promised to render nuclear weapons ineffective. This impulse, by the way, is something I think we can all celebrate about the Reagan years. The desire to avoid nuclear holocaust, especially from a guy who sounded like a war hawk when he was on the campaign trail. In 1985, he held his first summit with General Secretary Gorbachev to discuss disarmament in Geneva, Switzerland. Gorbachev was a reforming force in the Soviet Union, relaxing controls on the freedom of press and religion, opening up a more free market economy. But the Soviets and the US were still deeply involved in meddling in other countries. For example,
we support the Sandinista government in Nicaragua,
leaving Americans to illegally funnel money to the Contras.
We invaded Afghanistan.
In response, the US supported the Mujahideen, the group that would later become the Taliban, laying the foundation for 9/11. You can read the book Ghost Wars by Steve Cull for a deeper look. Both sides engaged in various proxy wars across the globe. So this summit covered a lot of ground. Actually, literally, there were several summits with Gorbachev. Some of them were a success as they built a friendship and understanding of each other, and at some, the US was woefully unprepared. Reagan yo-yoed in his attitude toward the Soviets, building bridges to them and also stepping up fears that he was being confrontational. SDI often came up in these talks with the Soviets. It was a real matter of contention. I mean, imagine one country has a missile defense shield and the other doesn't. If the Reagan administration had pulled this thing off, which they never were going to, it would have created a real disparity between the two countries. So the Reagan administration proposed a solution. We'll just give our SDI plans to the Soviets. That's right, we would literally give SDI's plans to the Soviets and allow them to construct defenses of their own. In return, we get a new sense of brotherhood and advance nuclear talks. The summit succeeded in opening up the relationship between the US and the USSR. Not a small feat for countries that had been targeting each other for decades. As Reagan said,
"We don't mistrust each other because we're armed. We're armed because we mistrust each other."
As we continue these mini episodes about Reagan's legacy, we're going to have some tough conversations about things like Reaganomics and the Iran-Contra scandal. Because Ronald Reagan has become a hero to conservatives, including religious conservatives. So we need to be honest about his legacy. That being said, he had some accomplishments. He really did open up communication with the Soviet Union, a crucial goal as the Cold War came to an end. Granted, he did sometimes stumble along the way, like when he made anti-Soviet jokes in front of Gorbachev. No, really, he made a pretty insensitive joke, which I'm going to paraphrase because it's pretty long.
A UN ambassador asked an American student, "What do you want to do when you're done with your studies?" The student replied, "I don't know. I haven't decided yet." The same ambassador asked a Soviet student the same question. "What do you want to do when you finish your studies?" The student replied, "I don't know. They haven't told me yet."
In front of Gorbachev! Read the room, Ronnie! Despite the poor choice of a joke, the arms talks were valuable. But they came at a steep cost. The crazy budgets surrounding SDI, a missile defense shield that just wasn't going to work. SDI became a political tool, something multiple interests could use. The Reagan administration employed it to calm down fears that Reagan would end humanity in a nuclear holocaust. It also provided leverage to the right wing of the Republican Party. They didn't like the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty that Nixon signed in 1972, in part because it limited defense weapon systems. SDI could help them break the treaty, thus opening up new abilities to increase our defenses, something that warhawks loved. The legacy of Star Wars, or SDI, is a weird one. Part expensive bargaining chip, part utopian dream, and part the emperor has no clothes. What does this have to do with the Christian church, with this whole season? As it turns out, a lot. It's the nexus of a lot of stuff we talked about this season. Fear of communism that excited talks of the end time, trickle-down economics, lowering taxes while cutting programs that benefit the poor. The Cold War was a huge driver for evangelicals in the United States. We used it for the sake of evangelism. We labeled the Soviet Union as Magog, the evil kingdom in the book of Ezekiel. And a bunch of evangelicals like Jerry Falwell put their hope in Ronald Reagan. Which means that the policies he took on impacted how people saw evangelicalism. Also, some of the usual suspects from this season were vocal supporters of SDI, including Jerry Falwell, Tim LaHaye, Bill Bright, Jimmy Swaggart, and Jim Baker, who endorsed it as a, quote, morally and perhaps militarily superior policy, end quote. As I covered earlier this season, big business pushed libertarianism and small government in evangelical circles. But when Reagan, their supposed political savior, came into office, he actually ballooned the national debt by $1.6 trillion, in no small part because of SDI, choosing a bogus sci-fi project over programs that benefited those in need, meaning that the evangelicals who backed him were equated with those policies. Don't believe me? Remember, Reagan made his evil empire speech to the National Association of Evangelicals. We were in the middle of this. It became part of our legacy. To Reagan's credit, so did his attempts to gain the advantage over the Soviet Union and de-escalate nuclear war. In Reagan, evangelicals with large followings like Jerry Falwell got their strongman leader. But conservatives weren't always in love with him. In fact, by the end of his second term, the far right was flat out appalled. Congress passed a number of things that made conservatives upset, from strengthening the bargaining power of unions to expanding the food stamps program and bolstering education. Not to mention the congressional sanctions placed on apartheid South Africa, which they passed despite a veto from Reagan. The religious right voted him in to promote things like the ban on abortion and prescribe prayer in schools, neither of which happened. They were upset about the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty, which limited us on certain kinds of nukes, leaving New Right co-founder Paul Weyrich to say,
Reagan is a weakened president, weakened in spirit as well as clout, and not in a position to make judgments about Gorbachev at this time.
Kind of a surprise from Weyrich, right? One of the guys responsible for bonding some evangelicals to conservative Republican politics. And he was less than thrilled with Reagan. It's valuable to see Reagan as a nexus, albeit an imperfect one, where the interests of war hawks, conservatives, religious folks, and small government people came together. He was a strongman figure, a confident, fatherly type who ran a tough guy campaign. And then, I think rightly, opened talks with our number one enemy, a poor kid who cut programs for the poor. A man who preached the gospel that hard work meant riches and laziness was the cause of poverty, even though he made his fortune by largely standing under bright lights and delivering lines he didn't write. Not exactly coal mining. A union organizer who shafted members of his union. A man who appealed to conservative Christians, even as he consulted a psychic. A disappointment to conservatives in his own time, who was later lionized as their gold standard. He fit nobody's agenda perfectly, but he gave the far right hope, even as he pushed the country further into debt with a dream fit for science fiction. A lot of the research for this episode came from the book Way Out There in the Blue by Frances Fitzgerald. I was fortunate enough to interview her a few years ago, and I found her to be a fascinating person. I used a number of other sources, and they're listed on the website and in your show notes. Truce is listener supported. Really. The only reason I can do this podcast full-time is because of people just like you who give $10 a month to keep this project going. Your support has given me the freedom to follow crazy stories like this one that you won't find on any other Christian podcast. Visit trucepodcast.com/donate to learn how you can help. A little bit means a whole lot. Thanks to everyone who gave me their voices for this.
This paid message is from the Table Podcast by the Hendricks Center at Dallas Theological Seminary. Join us for conversations in complex times as we discuss issues of God and culture to show the relevance of theology to everyday life. Our rotating host team connects life to the Bible with expert guests on a wide variety of topics. Find us on your podcast app, or for all videos, resources, and more, visit dts.edu/tableCT.
This paid message is from Voices at Our Daily Bread Ministries. I have Jesus. Why do I need the church? Is Christianity just a Western white man's religion? On Faith Under Construction, we tackle these questions with Black, Millennial, and Gen Z voices, exploring race, doubt, deconstruction, and spiritual fatigue. Rooted in Scripture, shaped by history, and grounded in lived experience, these are honest conversations about following Jesus today. Join us. There's space for you here.
Episode, including Bob Stevenson, Josh Griffith, Chris Sloan, Jackie Hart, and Marcus Watson of the Spiritual Life and Leadership podcast. Starting in 2 weeks, I'm going to start playing with the schedule a little bit, sometimes releasing a mini episode every week, and other times relying on the every other week pattern we've had for a few years, each exploring the legacy of Ronald Reagan. Subscribe so you get every new episode as it's released. Truce is a production of Truce Media, LLC. God willing, we'll talk again soon. I'm Chris Starrin, and this is Truce.